You
Alpha
defy
King
me
accepted
again,
arranged
and
marriage
it will
until
be your
Bride's veil
last
dropped and
breath.
changed everything. Rivers ran cold and deep, reflecting silver moonlight, and ancient stones marked the borders where kings of old had carved their empires. Here, power was everything. Loyalty was earned, fear was respected, and the throne demanded obedience above all else. King Kael'Vareth had ruled this kingdom for nearly a decade, and his name carried weight like a sharpened sword. Men feared his strength, advisors trembled at his gaze, and foreign kings whispered in hushed tones of the Alpha King who ruled with iron precision. Kael's life was one of duty and control, and for him, solitude had always been safer than connection. But now, he stood at the edge of a new era. The war between his kingdom and the neighboring house of Lyrian had left scars too deep for simple treaties. The council had spoken, as it always did, an arranged marriage, a political alliance disguised as matrimony. Kael had accepted it with the same calm certainty he applied to all his decisions. His future bride was Lady Seraphine Lyrian, a woman whose family name carried as much weight as his own, whose intelligence had been praised, and whose obedience was expected. The castle was alive with preparation. Tapestries were dusted and polished until they shimmered in torchlight. Servants scurried through marble corridors, balancing trays of gold and silver, while musicians tuned strings and flutes for the day of celebration. Kael walked through it all with measured steps, his armor polished, his cloak heavy with embroidered sigils. Nothing seemed capable of stirring the long-buried pulse of excitement he had not allowed himself to feel. Meanwhile, Seraphine stood in her chambers high above the courtyard. The room was filled with candles whose flames danced against the walls, casting long shadows that mirrored her inner conflict. She was beautiful, though not merely in the way that nobles admired beauty. There was a sharpness in her eyes, a quiet strength that drew attention without demand. She had been trained to obey her father's wishes, but obedience did not mean submission. The gown she wore was of deep sapphire, trimmed in silver. It hugged her form, flowing like water as she moved. Every detail had been chosen for politics, for appearances. Yet, beneath the elegance, Seraphine felt a tremor of uncertainty. The king she was to marry was known as a man unyielding in rule, feared in council, and merciless in battle. Could she find a place beside him without losing herself? Could he see her for who she truly was, not just the piece of a political puzzle? The ceremony was set in the great hall of Vareth Castle, a chamber so vast it seemed to echo the very heartbeat of the kingdom. Golden chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting light over the rows of nobility gathered to witness the union. Every eye was on the pair who would secure the peace of two great houses, though none could guess the hidden tension that lingered between them. When Seraphine entered, the hall fell into near silence. The soft rustle of her gown and the delicate click of her slippers against polished stone filled the space as all eyes followed her. Kael, waiting at the altar, felt a strange stirring he could not name. He had seen countless noblewomen, trained to bend and comply, yet there was something different about her. Something unspoken, something that tugged at the disciplined edges of his mind. As she approached, her gaze met his, and for a moment the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. There was a weight to her eyes, a quiet confidence wrapped in mystery. Kael's chest tightened, though he did not understand why. He had never needed to understand emotion. He had always controlled it. Yet now, a question gnawed at him. What did this woman carry beneath her poised exterior? The priest began the ritual, speaking words as old as the castle walls. Vows were exchanged, promises to protect, to honor, and to obey. Seraphine's voice was steady, even as her heart raced like a captive bird. Kael's tone was measured, a mirror of his controlled exterior. Every word they spoke seemed to carry a weight beyond the hall, as if the mountains themselves listened. And then it happened, the veil. For centuries, The custom had been for the bride to lift the veil only after the vows, revealing her face in full to the king she would call husband. The ceremony had followed every tradition, every protocol, until that moment when the cloth slipped from Seraphine's head. Cale's breath caught. He saw her face, flawless in its calm beauty, but his eyes were drawn to something else. A faint, glowing mark traced along her collarbone, delicate yet unmistakable. It pulsed faintly, as if alive. The sigil was ancient, a symbol from myths that spoke of powers both feared and revered. It was thought lost, erased from history, yet here it was, alive and present on the woman standing before him. 1,000 thoughts collided in Cale's mind, though none escaped his lips. He did not move, did not speak, only stared. Seraphine's gaze held his, unwavering. She knew what he saw. The mark was no secret, though she had hoped it would not matter until the right moment. In that instant, the air between them shifted. Something unspoken passed through the space, a connection neither could deny. Cale's control wavered for the briefest moment, and Seraphine felt it too. The pulse of power, the tug of destiny, the realization that this union was far more than politics. The court murmured softly, sensing the tension, though none understood its true nature. Whispers spread like shadows over the polished floors, speculation, fear, awe. Yet in the center of the hall, Cale and Seraphine stood, bound by vows and yet already caught in the gravity of something far older, far deeper than either had anticipated. After the ceremony, Cale retreated to his private chambers, a storm of thoughts raging behind his calm exterior. He paced the room, fingers brushing over the hilt of his sword as if seeking comfort in its weight. Power had always been clear to him, strength, strategy, control, but this was different. There was a force in her he could not command, a brilliance that challenged him rather than obeyed. It was terrifying, and yet it was irresistible. Seraphine, alone in her own room, removed her gloves and smoothed the fabric of her gown. Her mind was a labyrinth of worry and anticipation. Cale was not just a king. He was a man capable of commanding entire armies, capable of reading the subtle motions of the court like an open book. Could he see the magic within her as a threat, or could he understand it, respect it, even cherish it? Night fell over Werewolf Castle, the torches flickering in quiet corridors, shadows stretching like dark fingers across the walls. Both the king and his bride lay awake, worlds apart in their chambers yet connected by the invisible threads of destiny. Neither slept. Both pondered the future, an uncertain future, where power, duty, and something infinitely more intimate awaited. As the moon climbed higher, casting silver light over the castle, a single thought lingered in both of their minds. The veil had fallen, and with it, the calm predictability of their lives had ended. Outside, in the silent courtyard, a wolf howled at the sky. Its cry echoed off the mountains, a haunting melody that seemed to answer the unspoken question in the hearts of both Cale and Seraphine. What had just begun? The answer was unknown, and yet, deep in the marrow of the castle, something ancient stirred. A power long dormant, a destiny waiting to be fulfilled, and a bond that would challenge everything either of them had ever believed about love, duty, and themselves. The kingdom of Werewolf had witnessed a union of two powerful houses. But now it had witnessed the awakening of something far older, something neither Cale nor Seraphine could ignore. And that was only the beginning. The days following the wedding passed like a slow river, moving with the weight of obligation and tradition. Cale and Seraphine walked through the palace halls as king and bride, their hands brushing sometimes, their eyes meeting at other moments, carrying the silent tension of a bond neither fully understood. Cale, who had ruled his kingdom with unwavering discipline, found his thoughts repeatedly drifting to her. He tried to dismiss them, telling himself it was curiosity or the responsibility of a king to understand his new queen. Yet every glance at Seraphine stirred something unfamiliar, a pull, a recognition, a silent challenge that tested his control. Seraphine, too, found herself unsettled. She had anticipated fear, caution, or cold respect from her husband, but instead she saw a keen intelligence in Kale's eyes, a sharpness that reminded her of the wolves of her homeland. And beneath that sometimes just glimpses of curiosity, or perhaps wonder, lingered. She could not tell which frightened her more, his strength or the possibility that he might understand her in ways no one else ever had. The court tried to maintain normalcy. Nobles approached with flattery, gifts, and subtle tests of loyalty, but Kale remained distant. Only Seraphine, in her quiet, observant way, dared to meet his gaze without flinching. Each encounter between them was a careful dance of power, respect, and unspoken questions. One evening, the palace library became their meeting ground. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with tomes of history, magic, and lore. The scent of parchment and candle smoke hung heavy in the air. Kale had summoned Seraphine under the pretense of studying political treaties, yet both knew the true purpose, a chance to observe, to measure, and to understand. Seraphine turned the pages of a thick, leather-bound book, her fingers brushing the ink as though it carried secrets meant only for her. Kale stood near the window, watching her, noting the way her eyes narrowed when she read, the slight tilt of her head when she thought. "You read quickly," he said, his voice low, careful, but carrying a strength that filled the room. Seraphine glanced up, meeting his gaze. "I have to," she replied simply. "There is much to learn, and not all of it is safe to ignore." Kale's lips curved into a faint smile, almost imperceptible. "Safety has never been your priority, has it?" "Not when knowledge matters more than comfort," she said, and in that moment, Kale realized he admired her courage as much as he feared the power she carried. Their conversation drifted, touching on history, diplomacy, and old legends. When Seraphine spoke of her bloodline, her voice lowered, almost a whisper. "The mark on my skin, it is not merely a symbol. It is a key, though even I do not fully understand what it unlocks. Some call it a curse, some a blessing. I have been told it is dangerous. I have been told it is necessary." Kale's eyes darkened and he moved closer, standing just behind her. "Dangerous or not, it is yours, and I will not act without understanding it first. You are not alone in this." For the first time since meeting him, Seraphine felt a flicker of trust. It was fragile, like a candle flickering in the wind, but it burned nonetheless. And Kale, who had always measured his alliances in armies and borders, realized that trust could be stronger than any sword. But the palace held shadows beyond the walls of their chambers. Whispers of her mark and the power it represented began to stir among the nobles. Eyes watched them with suspicion. Some sought to gain favor, others plotted in secret. And somewhere in the dark corners of the kingdom, creatures long forgotten stirred, drawn to the awakening energy within Seraphine. Night after night, Kale found himself unable to sleep. He walked the palace corridors, armor left behind, mind racing with thoughts of her. Seraphine, too, wandered in her own quiet ways, walking the moonlit gardens, brushing her fingers over the stone walls as though they might reveal secrets. One night their paths crossed in the garden. The moon hung full, silver light spilling across marble fountains and carefully trimmed hedges. Kale emerged from the shadows, not by accident, and Seraphine did not startle at his presence. "You should not be out here alone," Kale said, his voice low but firm. "And you should not be wandering the palace without armor," she replied, a teasing edge in her tone. Yet beneath it lay seriousness. Both knew danger could come from anywhere. They walked together, silently at first, until Seraphine broke the quiet. "Do you ever feel that something in the world is changing?" Kale glanced at her. "Every day, since the moment your veil fell." Her lips parted slightly, a soft gasp almost lost in the rustle of the leaves. "You noticed? I cannot ignore it," he said simply. "There is something in you, something that mirrors me in ways I cannot name." The air between them was charged, unspoken words hanging like mist. Kale, who had always been master of his impulses, felt the pull of her presence as something more than curiosity. And Seraphine, who had always hidden her power behind calm composure, felt the stirrings of something new, recognition, perhaps, or destiny. Their quiet walk was interrupted by a sudden whisper from the shadows. A figure moved, unseen, listening. Cale's eyes narrowed, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword, while Seraphine's fingers glowed faintly, a shimmer of her hidden energy revealing itself. "You must be careful," Cale said, more to himself than to her. "The court is not as blind as it seems, and enemies wait for weakness." Seraphine nodded, the weight of responsibility heavy on her shoulders. "I know, and yet I cannot hide who I am forever." Cale stopped and faced her. "You do not need to hide from me," he said. "I do not fear what you are, but the world, the kingdom it might." They stood there, the moonlight casting long shadows across their faces. Neither spoke for a long moment. And then, without warning, Seraphine reached out, brushing her hand against Cale's. The contact was fleeting, but it left an imprint of warmth, a silent acknowledgement that they were bound by more than vows and duty. In the days that followed, Cale and Seraphine's interactions deepened. They shared lessons of strategy, practiced swordplay in secret courtyards, and spoke of the histories that shaped their kingdoms. Every encounter brought them closer, yet every moment was tinged with tension. Neither could fully understand the power within the other, nor predict how it would shape their future. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Seraphine led Cale to a hidden chamber beneath the palace. The walls were carved with runes that glowed faintly in the fading light, and the air smelled of ancient stone and magic. "This place has always been a refuge for my family," she said, tracing her fingers along a rune. "It holds memories, secrets, and the beginnings of the magic I carry. I want you to see it, to understand a part of me." Cale watched, careful, as she moved. The quiet reverence in her actions struck him deeply. For all his strength, his command, and his intellect, he felt a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to feel. And he realized slowly that understanding her fully might require more than knowledge or strategy. It might require trust and a willingness to surrender control, even if just a little. Hours passed in silence, yet the room seemed alive with energy. Neither spoke much, but each felt the bond between them growing stronger. And as they left the chamber, Cale knew something was shifting, not just between them but in the kingdom itself. Forces were stirring, drawn to Seraphine's power, and the quiet tension of their first days of marriage was about to be tested in ways neither of them could predict. That night, as the castle slept under a blanket of stars, a figure watched from the mountains beyond the palace. Cloaked in shadows, the stranger's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the moonlight. He spoke a single word, almost a whisper: "She is awakening." The word carried weight, a warning, and a promise. And inside the palace, Cale and Seraphine lay awake, unaware of the storm approaching. A storm that would test their trust, their courage, and the fragile connection forming between them. For in the kingdom of Verath, destiny was never patient, and power, once awakened, could not be ignored. The kingdom of Verath had grown quiet, but the silence was deceptive. Beneath the polished marble floors and golden chandeliers of the castle, a storm was stirring. Forces both political and magical were moving, drawn to the pulse of power that Seraphine carried. Even Cale, with all his experience and foresight, could feel the tension pressing against the edges of his control. It began with whispers in the halls, servants murmuring of shadows that moved without cause, of candles that flickered though no breeze passed, and of distant, unexplainable lights in the mountains. Cale dismissed some of it as superstition, yet the rest gnawed at him. He knew the kingdom, its people, and its history too well to ignore omens. Seraphine, meanwhile, felt the changes most acutely. Her powers, once quiet and restrained, were awakening in ways she could not yet control. At night she could hear whispers in the stone walls, as though the castle itself were speaking to her. Her mark pulsed faintly, glowing when emotions surged. She tried to hide it as she had always done, but even Kale noticed. One evening, Kale approached her as she walked in the moonlit gardens, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that left faint trails of shimmering light. "Your power is growing," he said quietly, careful not to alarm her. "You cannot hide it forever." Seraphine looked up, eyes wide, a mixture of fear and awe in her gaze. "I know, and I am afraid. If I lose control—" Her voice trailed off and Kale took her hands in his, steadying her. "You will not lose control," he said, firm but gentle. "I will not let anything harm you, nor will I let anyone take advantage of what you are. But you must trust me." Trust. It was a word that carried weight heavier than any sword in the kingdom. Seraphine nodded slowly. "I do trust you, but the world may not. And even if it does, I must learn to control this energy inside me." Kale's gaze softened, the first flicker of emotion breaking through the walls he had built around himself. "Then we will face it together. Whatever comes, we face it as one." Days later, a messenger arrived from the mountains, a rider cloaked in black with eyes that reflected the stormy sky. The message he carried was short and urgent. An ancient creature, long thought dormant, had been drawn to the awakening energy within Seraphine. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and powerful beyond the reckoning of ordinary warriors. Kale immediately called his council and informed Seraphine. "You must come with me," he said. "We cannot fight this alone." Seraphine's heart pounded, but she did not hesitate. She had spent years preparing for the moment her power would be needed. "I am ready," she said, voice steady despite the fear in her chest. They departed at dawn, mounted on black steeds that galloped through the misted forests. The journey was tense, each shadow and sound raising their vigilance. Kale's hand never left the hilt of his sword, yet he remained alert to Seraphine's presence beside him. As they reached the ruins of an ancient temple in the mountains, the air grew thick with energy. Stones glowed faintly, and the ground trembled under the weight of a power neither had faced before. The creature revealed itself, a massive being of stone and flame, its eyes burning with awareness of the energy Seraphine carried. Kale drew his sword, stance rigid, but he did not move alone. Seraphine stepped forward, hands glowing faintly as she channeled her power. The creature roared, a sound that shook the mountains, and advanced. "Focus," Kale said, his voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "Do not fear it. Control the power or it will control you." Seraphine nodded, closing her eyes, feeling the energy within her flow. Slowly she directed it, a beam of shimmering light striking the creature. It staggered, not defeated but restrained. Kale seized the moment, striking with precision, aiming to subdue rather than kill. Together, their combined efforts forced the creature back into the shadows, where it disappeared, leaving only scorched stones and faint embers. They stood together, breathless, yet victorious. The air between them was charged, a mix of triumph and relief. Kale's hand brushed against Seraphine's, lingering longer than necessary. She looked up at him, eyes wide with admiration and gratitude. "You were magnificent," he said quietly. "You controlled what could have destroyed us." "And you were steady," she replied. "Without you, I could not have done it." The bond between them deepened that night, forged not by vows alone, but by shared trial and the recognition of each other's strength. They returned to the castle changed, not only as king and bride, but as partners bound by destiny and power. Yet, even as they celebrated their victory, whispers continued in the shadows. The court, already suspicious of Seraphine's mark, grew bolder in their schemes. Some nobles sought to exploit her power for their gain, while others plotted to weaken Kale's rule by turning him against his bride. One night, a masked figure slipped into the palace gardens. Kale, ever vigilant, sensed the presence immediately. He and Seraphine moved through the shadows, silent as the night, until they confronted the intruder, a rogue sorcerer, exiled from a distant kingdom who sought to harness Seraphine's energy for himself. "You cannot control what you do not understand," the sorcerer sneered. "Give me the power or your kingdom falls." Kale stepped forward, sword drawn. "You threaten my queen, my kingdom, and yourself. Leave now or face justice." The sorcerer laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Justice? You think your swords can match magic like this?" He raised his hands, and the air shimmered with energy. Seraphine stepped forward, heart pounding, but her resolve stronger than ever. She focused on the power within her, drawing it out carefully, shaping it into a protective barrier. Kale moved beside her, ready to strike, but he let her lead. Together, their combined strength formed a force that the sorcerer could not withstand. The battle was fierce, energy clashing against steel and light. Finally, the sorcerer faltered, weakened by their unity, and fled into the night, leaving only a faint trail of shadow behind. Kale sheathed his sword and turned to Seraphine. "You have grown stronger than I imagined," he said, pride and awe in his voice. Seraphine smiled, a mixture of relief and exhilaration. "I had to. We cannot afford weakness. Not now." But even as they returned to the castle, the shadow of the next trial loomed. The ancient prophecy whispered by the seer still haunted their thoughts. The king who desires her, yet cannot claim her soul, will face a darkness only love can redeem. Neither fully understood the meaning, but both felt the weight of it pressing on their hearts. Trust had grown between them, yet fear lingered. Fear of what they could not yet see, of powers they could not yet control, and of the enemies who would not rest until Seraphine's energy was theirs. In the quiet of the night, Kale and Seraphine stood together on the balcony of the highest tower, the wind whipping around them, carrying the scent of forests, rivers, and the distant mountains. "You are changing me," Kale said, voice low. "Not just your power, but everything. My world, my rules, even my thoughts." Seraphine's eyes met his, soft and steady. "And you are changing me, teaching me that strength is not just about power, but about trust, courage, and hope." For a long moment they stood in silence, letting the wind and the moonlight speak for them. And then, from the mountains beyond, a distant roar echoed, a sound both familiar and terrifying. Kale's hand went instinctively to his sword, but Seraphine placed her hand on his, stopping him. "We face it together," she said, and he nodded, feeling the truth in her words. The next day, the court received news that a rival kingdom had moved its forces closer to Veyrath's borders. Kale and Seraphine knew that the challenges were only beginning. Their bond, tested in fire and shadow, would now be tested by armies, politics, and powers far older than either of them. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Kale and Seraphine prepared for what lay ahead. Together, they had faced the crucible of fire and ice, emerging stronger, yet aware that the true trials were still to come. And somewhere in the darkness, the faint pulse of ancient magic stirred, a reminder that destiny had only just begun to weave its web. The kingdom of Veyrath slept uneasily that night, unaware that its king and queen had faced not only monsters and sorcery, but the awakening of a bond that could either save or destroy them all. But Kale and Seraphine, standing together, knew one truth. No matter the darkness ahead, they would face it as one. The kingdom of Veyrath had never felt so tense. Rumors of magic, whispers of enemies, and the shadow of ancient prophecy hung over the castle like a storm cloud. Yet within the palace walls, Kale and Seraphine stood united, their bond tested and strengthened by trials of fire and shadow. Theirs was no longer a union of convenience. It had become a partnership forged in trust, courage, and mutual understanding. But destiny did not wait for calm. It began at dawn. A messenger arrived, breathless and pale, carrying news that rival armies had reached the northern border, and the exiled sorcerer had returned, this time leading an alliance of mercenaries and creatures drawn to Seraphine's power. The castle trembled under the weight of the threat, and the court erupted in panic. Kale called his council, his voice steady, his presence commanding as always. Yet even he felt the gravity of the situation pressing on him. "Prepare the defenses," he commanded, eyes scanning the room. Every soldier, every bow, every spellcaster at the ready, and his gaze fell on Seraphine. "We face this together." Seraphine nodded, the faint glow of her mark pulsing as though in agreement. "Together," she repeated. That night they walked the battlements, overlooking the dark forests where enemies gathered. The wind carried the scent of snow and distant fire. Kale's hand brushed hers, a small touch, but one heavy with unspoken promises. "You have grown stronger than even I imagined," he said quietly. "Your control over your power, it is remarkable." Seraphine looked at him, eyes shining in the moonlight. "And you, Kale, you have taught me trust, patience, and courage. I could not have faced any of this alone." A silence fell between them, filled with understanding and unspoken emotion. But there was no time to linger. The threat was approaching, and the castle needed them. As dawn broke, the first signs of the enemy appeared, a tide of mercenaries and dark creatures, moving like shadows across the northern plains. Kale's army formed quickly, disciplined and strong, yet the anxiety was palpable. Seraphine stood beside him, a calm force, her hands glowing faintly as she prepared to channel her power. The battle began with the clash of steel and the roar of creatures. Arrows flew, swords met shields, and magic crackled in the air. Kale led with unmatched skill, moving like a shadow across the battlefield, protecting his soldiers and striking at the enemy with precision. Beside him, Seraphine's power surged, forming barriers of light that shielded the vulnerable, beams of energy that repelled the creatures, and pulses of force that disarmed and stunned the enemy. But the exiled sorcerer had anticipated their strategy. He moved to confront them directly, his dark energy colliding with Seraphine's in waves of force. Kale met him with steel, parrying attacks and defending Seraphine with every strike. The three moved through the battlefield like forces of nature, light, shadow, and steel, each testing the limits of the others. "You cannot win," the sorcerer hissed, his voice carrying over the clash of battle. "You cannot control what you do not understand." Seraphine steadied herself, feeling the pulse of energy within her rise, controlled yet fierce. "I understand more than you think," she said, voice strong, eyes bright with determination. "And I will not let you harm my kingdom or anyone I love." Kale fought at her side, each swing of his sword in perfect rhythm with her energy. Together, they became unstoppable, not because they were stronger individually, but because they trusted each other completely. Every move, every decision, every thought was in harmony, forming a bond that even the sorcerer could not break. The fight reached its climax when the sorcerer unleashed a wave of energy meant to overwhelm them both. Kale pushed Seraphine behind him, shielding her, but she stepped forward, her power flaring brilliantly. The mark on her skin glowed with a strength that eclipsed the sorcerer's dark energy. She focused, drawing the full force of her magic, shaping it with precision and calm. The resulting burst of energy collided with the sorcerer's attack, a brilliant explosion of light and shadow that shook the mountains. When the smoke cleared, the sorcerer lay defeated, bound by Seraphine's magic, no longer a threat. The battlefield fell silent, save for the gentle wind that carried the scent of ash and earth. Kale turned to Seraphine, awe and relief in his eyes. You controlled it. You saved us all." Seraphine smiled, exhausted but triumphant. "We saved each other," she said, reaching for his hand. That evening the castle celebrated their victory, but Kale and Seraphine sought solitude. They climbed to the highest tower, looking out over a kingdom saved, yet forever changed. The night sky was clear, stars glittering like diamonds, and the moon bathed them in silver light. "You have changed my world," Kale said, voice low, carrying emotion he had rarely allowed himself to express. "I have always ruled with strength and fear. But with you I understand something more. Love is not weakness, trust is not surrender, they are power in their own right." Seraphine's eyes shone. "And you have shown me that control does not mean isolation, that courage is stronger when shared, and that destiny is not just a path we follow, It is a path we create together." They embraced, a quiet moment of relief and understanding. No words could capture the depth of what they had faced, the trials they had endured, or the bond they had forged. But destiny had one final test. In the days that followed, the seer who had first warned them arrived once more. She bowed to Cale and Seraphine, her eyes reflecting a knowledge older than time itself. "The prophecy is fulfilled," she said. "The darkness that threatened your kingdom is gone, but your journey is not over. Power, love, and destiny are forever intertwined. The mark upon you, Seraphine, is no longer a curse, it is a gift. And Cale, your heart has been tempered by trust and courage. Together, you will guide Vereth into an era of strength and peace." Seraphine's hand brushed against Cale's. "Then we are ready," she said softly. Cale nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the lightness that came from knowing they faced it together. "We are ready," he agreed. The kingdom of Vereth witnessed a new dawn. Soldiers returned to their homes, the court settled into cautious order, and the people looked to their king and queen with hope. Cale and Seraphine ruled side by side, their love no longer a quiet tension but a source of strength for the entire kingdom. Yet even in triumph, they knew that challenges would come. Magic was unpredictable, enemies were always present, and the weight of prophecy lingered. But for the first time, Cale and Seraphine understood that power, trust, and love were not separate, they were one. And together they could face anything. In the quiet of the palace, high in their chambers, they stood by the window, watching the sunrise. Cale's hand found Seraphine's, their fingers intertwined. The mark on her skin glowed softly in the morning light, a symbol not of fear, but of the strength they had discovered together. "You are my equal," Cale said, voice steady, eyes bright. "Not because of power, not because of title, but because we have faced everything together, and we are still standing." Seraphine smiled, leaning close. "And you are mine, not because you command, but because you trust, because you fight not just for me, but with me." The castle, the kingdom, and the world beyond seemed to pause in that moment, as if acknowledging the unity they had forged. And though the future remained uncertain, Cale and Seraphine knew one truth above all. Together, they were unstoppable. As they stood hand in hand, a soft wind brushed against their faces, carrying the faint scent of the mountains, the forests, and the magic that still lingered. It was a reminder that though the darkness had been faced and defeated, the world was vast, full of challenges, wonders, and destiny yet to unfold. Cale looked at Seraphine, his heart steady and sure for the first time in years. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Seraphine nodded, the light of her mark glowing faintly in the dawn. "Together," she echoed. And with that, the kingdom of Vereth entered a new era, a time of strength, of unity, and of love that could not be broken. The veil had fallen, the power had awakened, and the bond had been forged in fire, shadow, and trust. The Alpha King and his bride had found not only each other but themselves, and in doing so, had changed their world forever.